Pro-life talk. Real world answers. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I'm Josh Brahm. I'm here with Gabi, Vehrs, and Steve Wagner, the Director of Training with Justice for All. And today we are extending the conversation that we began last episode. We were talking about terms, the pro-life, pro-choice, anti-choice. I want to take that in a different direction. What terms do we use when we talk about the life, the living entity that is killed in an abortion? A lot of pro-life people would just immediately, duh, it's a baby. It's a child, or it's an unborn child. Whereas some people would call it a zygote or an embryo or a fetus, depending on what stage of development you're talking about. Some people say fetal human. That's the conversation I want to have right now. What should we, and just starting with when we're in dialogues with people that are not pro-life, and we're going to have a good conversation about this issue, or attempt to have a good conversation about this issue. When you're in the beginning of this dialogue, when you've just begun, you're going to have to refer to whatever we don't want to be killed.
Well, I think it's interesting that you started that way, Josh, because my answer to this question is it depends on where you are in the conversation. I'm going to call the living human organism that's in the womb, I'm going to call that something different if I haven't yet defended the idea that it is a living human organism.
Why?
I'm just going to use the term unborn.
Unborn?
Yeah, and the reason is I think it's the most neutral sounding term in the discussion. Not neutral because I don't think there's a right answer about it. I'm not trying to be neutral about the unborn. I just don't want to introduce into the conversation impediments. I think I said that in the last episode. That's the principle here. Why put a stumbling block in the way of the person that you're talking to that is unnecessary? Now, if somebody makes a case that it's necessary to use a different term, I'm open to that. But at this point, I don't see it as necessary to use any other term than unborn, and at least until a point in the conversation where we agree on what the unborn is. Now, if we agree that the unborn is a living human organism, then I might use the term human being to refer to that living human organism. But I'm probably going to preface it by saying I don't know what else to call a living human organism but a human being. Would you agree that they're a human being biologically? And that's how I might.
There's something really important you just did, and I think we need to underline that. You said, do you believe it's a human being biologically? Which means you're being really specific here about whether you're talking about the biology or the philosophy, because my concern has always been when we use the term human being, a lot of times what we mean as pro-lifers is this biological, it's a living member of our species. When most pro-choice people hear the term human being, as soon as the word being gets added to that, or even sometimes human, but certainly when we say human being, that sounds like person to them, and they think we're already introducing something philosophical before we've even gotten there. So talk a little, just kind of respond to that, or talk a little bit about, do you think there's an equivocation that might happen if you say it's a human being without using biological?
I think that's right. I think that if you say human being, but you don't qualify that you mean it biologically, it's possible that there would be this it would be unclear to the person you're talking to what you meant. And they're probably going to push back and say, well, I don't think it's a human being. And you might say, well, I think it is a human being. Well, I don't think it is a human being. And you're probably arguing at that point about philosophy or whether it's the sort of human organism that should be protected. I don't know.
So is your direction here to use neutral terms until you've agreed on a principle, and then to change your terms to something more accurate, and then try to find agreement on the philosophy, and then you might start calling it a baby or a child? Is that basically the principle in play here?
Well, I don't think that I don't think I always change my terms at the point in the conversation where somebody agrees that it's a human being biologically. I'm not necessarily going to call it a baby at that point, because baby is equivocal. To me, a baby is a human organism up until, say, something like 2 years. Right. From fertilization to 2 years. To them, a baby is a valuable human. Up until 2 years. But that might not include any entity in the womb.
I've got a question for you then, Steve, because I know many pro-life people would say we're helping humanize the unborn when we use terms like baby or he or she, or referring to the child in the womb. And I know as pro-life advocates, we want to humanize the unborn through our arguments, through using fetal development pictures. Why would you avoid using these terms if it could help humanize the unborn for the person you're talking to?
I am all for humanizing the unborn, and I agree with David Lee when he says that the dehumanization of unborn children is like a done deal or a fait accompli. It's been accomplished in our culture that many people, and probably a majority, don't think of the unborn as one of us. So I am not in any way wanting to promote that dehumanization, even in how I talk to myself, and especially not in how I talk to other people. The problem is I don't think it actually dehumanizes. I don't think that using a different term would humanize the unborn I don't think it would actually have that effect. Because think about what's happening in the person's mind. There's a bunch of conflicting ideas. Maybe it's just mush in their mind about what the unborn is. And so if I add in a term, sure, it may have the impact for some people of helping them think more, helping them think the unborn's a human. Is that what we mean by humanize? To humanize the unborn would be to help people see the unborn as human. I'm going to do that not with a term. I'm not going to rely on a term for that. I'm going to make a good argument that the unborn's living. If it's growing, it must be alive, or something like that. Or if it has the three characteristics of living things. I'm going to make an argument that it's human. Well, it has human parents, or it has a human DNA fingerprint. I'm going to make an argument that it's an organism. That if you and I are organisms, and all that was added from fertilization to where we are now is adequate nutrition and a proper environment, then the unborn must have been an organism at fertilization. I'm going to try to humanize the unborn by making an argument that they're like us, biologically and then philosophically. I don't think that using the term unborn, which is my preferred term, I don't think that it promotes dehumanization. I haven't really seen that in the conversations I've had. What I've seen is I just then can keep focused on the real issue, which is what is that thing or that entity or that object. Now, some pro-life people would object to me saying the unborn is an object or a thing. All I'm trying to do is just, I'm using those terms philosophically. Right. It's something rather than nothing. So what is that entity in the womb? And I've found that just using the term unborn, sometimes I'll even on campus say, well, that thing in the womb. Now, this is the last thing it's the last thing in the world that I want to do, to promote people thinking it's just a thing. So again, like we said in the last episode, I'm not going to use that terminology in a written piece unless I have the ability to lay a context and to then argue for what the unborn is. Same thing in my conversation. If I'm giving a speech that's 30 seconds long, I'm going to be really careful about every word I use.
What about zygote or embryo or fetus? These are considered medically accurate terms. So a lot of pro-choice people would prefer that we're being specific and medically accurate. But then I've heard pro-life people say that there's no more dehumanizing word than fetus. And I heard one pro-life professional call that the F word for the pro-life movement, and never, ever say the word fetus again. I'd like to get your guys' take on zygote, embryo, and fetus. I'll start with you, Gabi.
Well, I guess if I'm talking to a pro-life person, my first question would be, is that like, do you feel that terms like neonate, which is a medical term for an infant, and adolescent are also dehumanizing? Or is there something else going on when people use the term fetus and zygote that you feel is especially dehumanizing? Because I think usually when pro-life people say something like that, I could be wrong, But it's not the term itself that's problematic. It's the fact that the pro-choice movement and different pro-choice advocates have used it with an intent to dehumanize, or to, because they don't believe the unborn is a valuable human being, they're using it and then equivocating that it's a fetus, not a valuable human being, because obviously a fetus is this other entity other than a baby, which is a born human or a neonate or something like that.
Well, I remember, I had a conversation with someone that I think did use neonate in a dehumanizing way, because I was asking her about infanticide. She was strongly pro-choice. And so I went to ask her a question about infanticide, and she kind of tried to make this vague answer about whether it'd be ever okay to kill a neonate. And I was like, neonate? Like, who says neonate? I mean, why aren't you saying
nurses?
Really? Why are you not saying baby? Do we not think it's a baby?
Child development specialists. Yeah.
So I agree. She wasn't a child development specialist or a psychologist. So I think she was trying to do something a little bit underhanded, which was kind of bring in on purpose. Maybe she wasn't doing it on purpose. I think she was, but she's trying to dehumanize whatever entity we're talking about, whether it be our right to kill. So I wonder, is there ever an appropriate time if people are using the word fetus, like with stank on it, like to actually kind of, narrate the debate here and be like, hey, now the way you use that word seems like, what do you mean when you use the word fetus? Is that a bad direction to go, or do we just only, yeah?
I'd probably put that in the same category as scolding someone for using bad language in a conversation on campus or something. I don't do that. I don't say, oh, wait, there's women around. And the reason is I'm going to let that person be who they are so that they can feel comfortable rethinking their position. If I add all these things into the conversation to make myself feel better or to make myself feel less more comfortable, because some of that language makes me feel uncomfortable. Some language that we're talking about, if somebody calls the unborn fetus or calls the infant a neonate, that might make me uncomfortable. But why do I need to? I think I just want to suffer that discomfort for the sake of the person I'm talking to, instead of calling them out. Now, there's certainly times to call people out for things that they are saying or doing, but in general, as a general principle, I don't want to make a big deal out of that for someone else. Now, for someone who disagrees with me. Mm-hmm. For a pro-life person that I may be trying to mentor, or someone that is new to dialogue who hasn't thought about this, I'm going to take the same approach that we take with anybody, the 3 essential skills. I'm going to ask them, so how do you think that term is working out in your conversations? Is it helping? You just spent 10 minutes talking about whether the unborn is a zygote or whether it's a baby. And you weren't talking about any reasons you might give for any position. You were just debating terms. Did that work out? Did that work in your conversation?
Worst thing ever.
I have 2 reasons that I'm a little concerned about using the term zygote or embryo or fetus in the conversation. And I want to say first that I agree with any pro-life advocate who's concerned about terms in this sense. We want to use terms that are helpful and not hurtful, or helpful to people changing their minds, and helpful to people humanizing the unborn. So that's a general principle I'm going to agree. So I agree with the impulse or the motivation. Right. The motivation behind using the term preborn, for example, is awesome. We want people to see the unborn as a human who could be born or who should be born. Right. So when pro-life advocates argue that we should use the term preborn for that reason, I'm really on the same page with them in terms of the motivation. The concern I have about terms like zygote, fetus, embryo, I have 2 concerns. One is there are cow fetuses, and there are bear fetuses, and so if you just talk about a fetus, I've found in my conversations sometimes. There's an indeterminate part of that. Sometimes people will say, well, it's just a fetus. Okay, well, then I always have to ask, well, what do you mean by that anyway? So I don't want to use that same kind of indeterminate language. Fetus is just a stage of an organism. It's a certain stage that we as a human community have named to try to pick out that this is after the embryonic stage, or after the time when all of your organs are being formed and developed. Now the fetal stage is when it's basically growth that happens from that point on. You're maturing those organs, but the organs are already in place. That's just a name we've given to that period. But because it can be applied to any mammal, I think that's a concern. And then the other problem I have is that a lot of times I'm trying to talk about the whole unborn period, from fertilization to birth. And we're trying to talk about whether that's a valuable entity from fertilization to birth. And if I use embryo, somebody says, well, no, it's a fetus. And if I use fetus, they say, no, I'm talking about embryos. Or if I use fetus, I'm only talking about the unborn from 9 weeks on. And most abortions happen before 9 weeks from fertilization. And so then I'm not even talking about most abortions. And so I've just found that all that complexity goes away if I just use a more general term that covers the whole period of from fertilization to birth.
Okay, so a bunch of pro-lifers listening are right now thinking, okay, well, let's split the difference. Let's call it a fetal human. At least then we're making it clear that it's not a bear fetus and it's not a cow fetus, but at least you're humanizing the unborn by bringing in the kind of the human aspect of it, but then you're also trying to be like scientifically accurate. What do you think about fetal human?
Well, I'm concerned about using fetal human. It would depend on the context, or depend on the conversation.
Let's say we're
perhaps.
just talking to a pro-choice person on campus. That's pretty much generally what we're going for.
So I'm going to say,
here.
well, so what do you think the fetal human is? And the person's going to say, well, I guess it's a human. But they're not going to get a chance to really think through their position, because we've already stated for them what their position should be. See, I want to say, what is the organism at the fetal stage that's in the womb of this woman? What is that? So, because I want them to think through whether it's a human for themselves. If I say fetal human, I'm already adding something into the conversation and not letting that be discovered from within the conversation and come out of the conversation that we're having. I'm also concerned because human can mean something biological. It can mean something. People use the term human to mean what you are. Josh, what you are, Gabi. You're humans. What does that really mean? That means you're a living human organism, but it's a shorthand for that. And for some people, it's a shorthand for living human organism with the same value that the rest of us have, or with a certain kind of rights, like basic rights, or a person, or whatever. They use human as shorthand. So if I say fetal human, I think it's going to come across to some people as like a stacking of the deck, or we're adding a term in to kind of move the argument in our direction, but it feels illicit to that person.
So is there a sense where we're basically trying not to beg the question? Are we trying to avoid circular reasoning here by adding these things that we believe to be true? We believe the unborn to not only be living human organisms or members of the human species, we also think that they're fully valuable human beings that should have the same legal rights that you and I have, or persons, or whatever you want to call that. We think those things. When we start in the very beginning of conversation by calling this, what do you think about this person in the womb at fertilization? Are we basically trying to avoid begging the question?
I think that's right. I think that's why I sometimes change my terminology in this way once I've defended a certain idea. So if I've defended that the unborn's a living human organism and the person agrees with me, let's just say we've agreed on that, I'm going to start calling it a he or a she. Because I want to, as quickly as possible, be humanizing the unborn. But see, now we've agreed it's a human organism, and you don't have human organisms that aren't either a he or a she.
Does it have gender from the moment of fertilization, Steve?
It definitely has it has sex. It has a sex. Depends on what you mean by gender, but yes, it has male or female sex from the moment of fertilization. I think I'm going to call the unborn he sometimes, because that'll distinguish it from the mom. Distinguish him from the mom, because otherwise it's confusing in the conversation. I have two she's sometimes, or I'm going to call the unborn a she when I have the chance, because I think that is going to help to humanize the unborn. But I don't feel uncomfortable calling the unborn an it, because in the conversation we haven't demonstrated yet what the unborn is.
You haven't agreed on the biology yet.
So, Steve, how do we use this, though, if we're writing? I understand in dialogue, wanting to create dialogue, wanting to help the person journey with you in discovering the humanity of the unborn. But if we're talking on Facebook, or if we're writing blog posts, or even more professional writing, how do we refer to the unborn? Do we just say the unborn? How do we use pronouns in those situations?
I think I'm going to use the same principles that we've been laying out here in writing. I'm going to use the term unborn until I demonstrate in the written piece that the unborn is a living human organism. Then I might use the term he or she. I might use the term baby or child, depending. It depends on probably the context.
So if there's a blog post, are you saying that if the pro-life blogger would need to basically make an argument in the blog post that the unborn is a living human organism before using he or she? And if they're not going to do that, should they just go with kind of the more neutral terms in that blog post if they're choosing for a word count not to make this kind of whole argument and copy and paste the same thing into the beginning of every single blog post? Yeah,
I think that would be my view.
What about the word preborn? You mentioned the word preborn. You had thoughts about the word preborn. I'm interested because I've heard a few. This is, I think, more new to at least me. I've seen it popping up, but now I know that there's a few pro-life people that strongly believe that we should use the term preborn and not unborn. And I haven't talked a lot with them to learn about why they think that way. But maybe you have. I'm just interested in your thoughts on preborn versus unborn.
I'm not sure I have a strong view on it, as if it's definitely worse to use the term preborn in dialogue or writing than it is to use the term unborn. I just know that I've used the term unborn for years, and I've really following Scott Klusendorf's teaching, or just that's been his practice, and I've found it to be helpful to the conversation. So I don't have a lot of experience using the term preborn, and I'd be interested to know what the quality of the dialogue is when people are using that term. I do have a concern about it, and that is that I think that it is associated with pro-life groups or with people who are doing pro-life advocacy. And I think it then sometimes tips off the person I'm talking to. If I were to use that term, I think it would tip them off to wherever they've heard that term, which might be online if they've ever seen an article from some pro-life group. And typically when I'm in a conversation with someone, I don't make it real clear right up front. I don't say, by the way, I'm a pro-life advocate, or I'm working in the pro-life movement, because so I feel like that's
get paid to talk to people like you.
Right. I mean, I feel like that's an impediment to the conversation.
Right.
Where I want to. It's not like I want to hide my position, or I want to put myself out there as something I'm not. That's not the point. It's just I'm not going to introduce into the conversation impediments like I have to use this term because it makes me feel better about the conversation or more comfortable. I will say, though, there are pro-life advocates I respect who are very purposeful about using the term preborn. I think there's a dialogue to be had about that. It's a fairly neutral sounding term. It doesn't say that the preborn is a human, but if you add human to it, which is many times the practice, well, what do you think the preborn human is? Then I think that has the same difficulty that we talked about earlier. Yeah.
So what are some other resources people can use, whether it's in their conversations online or in person, to humanize the unborn?
Well, I feel strongly that we shouldn't rely on terms to do the humanizing work for us. I think we should rely on good arguments. That's what we've been talking about here. And even if we disagree in the pro-life movement about which terms to use, let's at least come together and agree that we need to be making good arguments.
Absolutely.
that humanize the unborn, that we need to be using fetal development pictures and ultrasound images to humanize the unborn. So my favorite website in this regard is the Endowment for Human Development, ehd.org.
Love that website.
You can see the unborn in the womb at 6 weeks. You can see the unborn's heart beating within his or her chest because the skin at that point is transparent. That's a great window into the womb and actually even into the unborn's body that can help someone to start to think differently about the unborn. So I highly recommend that site.
So here's what I hear you saying, Steve. I just want to kind of sum up because I feel like we're talking about something that's pretty controversial to at least some pro-life people that I've engaged on Facebook or who have engaged me. I think what I hear you saying is that we really do care about the child in the womb, who we believe is totally a child, and I think we've got good arguments for that. We haven't stated all of those in this episode, so forgive me for, I'm just going to say, we believe this is a child. We care about it so much that we're basically spending our life trying to make it illegal to kill them in the womb. But we also care about the pro-choice person.
Well, see, I think we care about the unborn enough to care about the pro-choice person.
Right.
And to treat and to care and to change our terminology about the unborn. So it sounds odd, but I would say we care about the unborn so much that I'm willing to call him an it some of the time. Because my goal is not that I use the right terms. My goal is that this person I'm talking to has the best shot at changing his or her mind.
Well, I know in the conversations that I've had, when I've used neutral terms in the beginning of the conversation, I don't end up with these things that I've seen where it's like we just end up in this like war about terms and debates, and then we just walk away. I end up with good conversations where we can talk about the actual issues step by step by step. And it's certainly been helpful for me, and I think I've seen Gabi do the same thing. And so, at least try it. At least try using neutral terms in the beginning of a conversation, and then humanizing the unborn through the arguments that you make. That is our episode of Life Report. I would love to hear, what are your favorite terms? What terms do you think we should be using, and do you disagree with any of the things that we've said in this episode? You can go to prolifepodcast.net/181 for episode 181 and leave us a note in the comments. That's our show, and remember, you can always have a great impact on any conversation about any topic if you ask good questions. Ask good questions, listen to understand, and find genuine common ground when possible. That's our show. Have a great week. Now go talk to someone.
You've been watching Life Report, pro-life talk, real world answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.